For those who are attending the first congressional hearing, let me explain a few items of procedure. I'll deliver a brief opening statement and then recognize my colleague, Senator Nelson, to do it as well. Then we will turn to our witnesses for their opening statements, and Senator Nelson and I will then pose questions to the witnesses. We have two panels. We're very pleased that we have such a great turnout, a large, enthusiastic, and interested audience for the hearing. It demonstrates the importance of this issue. At the outset, I want to note, though, that the rules of the Senate when it comes to these hearings are rather strict. They prohibit outbursts or demonstrations of any kind at the public hearing. As chairman, it's my responsibility to enforce the rules. If there are disruptions, I will warn those responsible, and if they continue to interrupt, I have no choice but to ask for the removal of those persons from this here in the room. Let me say at the outset that 4 days from now, hundreds of thousands of people across the state of Florida will go to their polling places to cast a ballot for the person best prepared to represent their political party in the next year's presidential election. This time-honored tradition of public debate, intense campaigns, and the orderly selection of party nominees is the hallmark of our democracy and every democracy. Of course, the core element of that democracy is the constitutionally protected right of every citizen of legal age to cast a vote for the candidate of his or her choice. It's important that we recall that until the early 20th century, most American adults could not legally vote. And even after the franchise right to vote was legally expanded, a violent racist campaign prevented many African Americans from voting. Sadly, the Jim Crow laws of that era were a reality in this state. It was not until 1969 that Florida became one of the last states to ratify the 19th Amendment, which expanded the right of women to vote. 6 constitutional amendments and numerous laws, regulations, and court decisions have helped make the promise of one person, one vote a reality in Florida and all across America. But we must be constantly vigilant against threats to these hard-fought victories. The Supreme Court Citizens United decision, which was issued 2 years ago this week, opened a floodgate of special interest money into campaigns. I don't have to tell people living in Florida about that. At the same time, over the course of last year, the right to vote has come under question, if not attack, nationwide. In more than 35 states, legislation has been introduced that threatens to roll back the progress our country has made over several generations, expanding and protecting the right to vote. More than a dozen states have already enacted laws that eliminate same-day registration, require voters to present restricted forms of identification before voting, reduce the number of early voting days, and make it harder for first-time voters to register. These new voting laws appear to be part of a coordinated and well-funded effort to reduce turnout among specific groups of people, namely minority, young, low-income, and rural voters. In response to this disturbing trend, our subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights held the first congressional hearing in Washington to examine these new state voting rights laws in September of last year. At that hearing, we learned that these new state voting laws threaten to keep as many as 5 million Americans from voting this year. As the testimony of today's hearing will demonstrate, many of these voters who may find their path to the ballot box blocked or filled with obstacles live right here in the state of Florida. Senator Bill Nelson approached me and asked me to hold this field hearing because of his concern that the constitutionally protected rights to vote are under attack. Today's hearing is the first ever field hearing of this subcommittee. For the record, the Republican members of the committee were invited to attend. As well, they were given an opportunity to present witnesses. They have suggested a witness who will be on the first panel considered by this subcommittee hearing. I want to thank Senator Nelson for his concern and advocacy on this issue, which I share, and I'm happy that he is with me today. We will hear from today's witnesses about HB 1355 that made a number of changes in Florida's voting laws. First, cutting the number of early voting days almost in half from 14 to 8. Second, eliminating early voting on Sunday before the election. Third, requiring third-party organizations that register voters to register with their state and meet an array of onerous administrative requirements or face hefty fines of hundreds or even thousands of dollars. Requiring Florida residents who have moved within the state and are updating their addresses at their polling site to vote a provisional ballot. For the record, more than 40% of the provisional ballots were not counted in our last election. Governor Rick Scott signed HB 1355 into law last year in Florida. In September of last year, I sent the governor a letter asking whether he planned to take any action to ensure that HB 1355's new restrictions would not disenfranchise legally able voters in Florida. To date, the governor has not responded to my letter. I also invited Governor Scott to attend this hearing today, hoping he would come personally to explain his support for HB 1355 and answer the questions raised about the law. I'm disappointed that he won't be able to join us. If Governor Scott or a designated representative of his administration accepted our invitation, they would have had an opportunity to answer some pretty important questions. Was the provision of HB 1355 that eliminates early voting on the Sunday before an election specifically targeted to reduce the turnout of African American and Latino voters, who make up an overwhelming number of voters who show up on the Sunday before the election? Did the Florida legislature anticipate that HB 1355's new administrative requirements for third-party voter registration groups and the threat of fines imposed would force groups like the League of Women Voters, Rock the Vote, and the Boy Scouts, as well as other respected organizations, to suspend their nonpartisan voter registration drives? Why does HB 1355 require Floridians who attempt to update their addresses on election day to cast provisional ballots, a large percentage of which are not counted in the final result? I am pleased, though, the governor, if he could not attend, that we do still have a distinguished panel, two panels of witnesses who will provide insight. Before recognizing Senator Nelson for an opening statement, I'm going to ask consent for the record for him to participate in today's hearing and make it clear that it's been my practice in Washington to invite senators, even if they're not members of the committee or subcommittee, but have an intense personal interest or local interest in the issue, to participate. So this is not a new approach, but for the record, I am asking consent for the participation of Senator Nelson, and without objection, he's recognized. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this historic first time your subcommittee in a state where we have a serious question of the civil rights of people being denied. All of us agree that the right to vote is a precious right, and it sets apart the United States from a lot of the countries of the world. In our own country, so many times young men and women have put on the uniform of this country to defend it. And one of those things they're defending is the right to vote. And we've seen in our history, when this right has been constricted, that painfully the country has come through the experiences realizing that the right to vote and to be able to cast that ballot without obstruction is the way that our Constitution envisions that America should be operating. And as you have eloquently pointed out, Mr. Chairman, that right is paramount among all constitutional rights. We, the people, emanate and give adherence to the right to govern us, but we select those who govern. When that right is impeded, then the very government itself is threatened. Now, of all places, Florida, what we went through in the year 2000 in a presidential election, seeing the inability of voters to cast a ballot and to cast it to be counted as they intended. To the credit of the state of Florida, after that experience, they made the laws of Florida such that it was easier to vote. Thus, we had early voting. And thus, the old absentee ballot, where you actually had to swear that you were going to be absent on the day of voting, that was changed to vote by mail. And, of course, organizations such as the League continued to register voters. And for decades, that law was such that once they registered a voter, they had 10 days in which to turn those names in. And of course, what we've seen is the constricting of those rights in this law that is now the law of the state of Florida. Ultimately, this is going to be decided by a judicial panel that is convened, where the very law itself, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, is being challenged. And for a redress of these grievances, since apparently there's not going to be a changing of the law in the state legislature with the cooperation of the governor, apparently it's going to have to be changed by the courts looking at this and determining if people are constricted in their right to cast their ballot. I think the witnesses that we are going to hear today will give ample testimony that that is the case. For when specific groups of people are targeted, when you find that voting on Sundays has been particularly popular with Hispanics and African Americans, and you take away one of those Sundays in the law. When you find that, as we've already mentioned, the League of Women Voters can't take the chance that one of their members, in doing a civic good, is going to be fined up to $1,000. When you see the enormous participation, because young people, for a change, started getting excited about government and politics, as we were in my generation, and then along came a lot of changes, and the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, and the souring of young people on what was going on in politics and government. And yet they got energized once again. And that college student wants to go down and register, and they register. And then if that college student, under the existing law, then happens to go down on election day, try to vote, show me your identification. They pull out their driver's license. Their driver's license shows the address in another county of where they grew up, their parents. And they're not going to get a ballot. They're going to get a provisional ballot. And the facts are facts. Look how many provisional ballots were not counted in the last presidential election. And so, Mr. Chairman, I can't thank you enough for convening this hearing. I'm looking forward to this testimony. Thank you very much.